Look, we need to talk about what's coming for China. And I'm not talking about some minor economic hiccup or a few years of slower growth. I'm talking about an economic depression that would make Japan's lost decades look like a minor recession in comparison. This isn't fear mongering. This is looking at the structural realities of the Chinese economy and recognizing the parallels to 1990s Japan are superficial at best, while the underlying vulnerabilities are far, far worse. Let me start with the most crucial difference that everyone seems to overlook. Japan got rich first. When Japan's asset bubble burst in 1991, it was already a wealthy, developed nation. The average Japanese citizen had accumulated real wealth. They had savings, they owned their homes, and the country had built world-class infrastructure and institutions. Japan's per capita GDP at the start of its lost decade was roughly $29,000, comparable to the United States at the time. They had successfully climbed the economic ladder, reached the top, and then stagnated. China is trying to get rich and dealing with a bursting bubble simultaneously. Chinese per capita GDP today hovers around $10,000, barely a third of what Japan had achieved before its crisis began. Think about what this means. Japan could afford to stagnate because its citizens were already comfortable. China is facing economic crisis while hundreds of millions of its citizens are still poor. It still has massive development needs, while it hasn't yet secured its position as a high-income country. This is the middle income trap on steroids. Countries that get stuck here, and there are many, typically never escape. They hit a wall where their low-cost manufacturing advantages disappear, but they haven't developed the innovation, institutions, and productivity to compete with advanced economies. China is hitting this wall at highway speed, with demographic decline and property crises acting as additional weights dragging it down. But here's where it gets really ugly, and where we need to talk about the fundamental dysfunction at the heart of the Chinese economic model. The currency itself is essentially worthless as a real store of value or medium of international exchange. Now, I know that sounds dramatic, but hear me out. The yuan isn't a real currency in the way that we understand currencies in market economies. It's a managed, manipulated tool of state control. You can't freely convert it. You can't take it out of the country without restrictions. Chinese citizens themselves don't trust it. That's why capital flight has been a persistent problem whenever controls loosen even slightly. That's why wealthy Chinese have spent decades trying to get their money into real estate in Vancouver, Sydney, London, anywhere they can park wealth in real assets denominated in real currencies. The Japanese yen, by contrast, was and is a fully convertible, trusted international currency. When Japan's crisis hit, the yen actually strengthened at various points. International investors could and did hold yen-denominated assets. The currency itself was never in question. This meant Japan could run enormous fiscal deficits to stimulate its economy without triggering a currency crisis. The Bank of Japan could experiment with unconventional monetary policy. Japan had options. China doesn't have these options. If China truly opened its capital account tomorrow, you'd see capital flight that would make your head spin. The government knows this. That's why the controls remain so tight. But these controls come with enormous costs. They prevent the efficient allocation of capital. They trap Chinese savings inside a domestic financial system that's increasingly obviously dysfunctional. And they mean that when crisis comes, the government's toolkit is fundamentally limited. You can't do quantitative easing the way Japan did if your currency isn't trusted. You can't run unlimited fiscal deficits if there's a real risk of capital flight and currency collapse. China is trapped by its own control mechanisms. And this brings us to perhaps the most fundamental problem, the command and control nature of the Chinese economy itself. Every major economic crisis in history has required adjustment, reallocation of resources, creative destruction. Bad investments need to fail. Zombie companies need to die. Resources need to flow to productive uses. This is painful but necessary. The Chinese system is fundamentally designed to prevent exactly this kind of adjustment. The government props up state-owned enterprises regardless of profitability. Local governments are incentivized to inflate GDP figures and keep growth going at any cost. Banks are instructed to keep lending to insolvent borrowers. The entire system is geared toward maintaining stability and the appearance of growth rather than actual economic health. We've seen this movie before. It's called the Soviet Union. An economy can run on state direction and command growth for a while, especially when you're in catch up mode and can copy technologies and business models from abroad. But eventually, you hit a point where you need real innovation, real productivity growth, real market signals to allocate resources efficiently. The Chinese Communist Party has made it abundantly clear that it will not relinquish the control necessary for this to happen. Look at what's happened over just the past few years. When the tech sector got too independent and powerful, the government crushed it with regulatory crackdowns. When entrepreneurs got too visible and wealthy, they disappeared or were brought to heel. The message is clear. The party's control matters more than economic dynamism. This is the opposite of what China needs to escape the middle income trap. Consider the property sector, which accounts for roughly 25 to 30% of Chinese GDP when you include all related industries. This sector is in free fall. Evergrande, Country Garden, and numerous other developers have defaulted. Millions of Chinese families have paid for apartments that will never be completed. The wealth effect that drove consumption for years is reversing. And here's the thing, the government could let these companies fail, restructure the sector, and move on. That's what you do in a market economy. But they can't. Because of the social stability implications, because of the way local government finances depend on land sales, because the entire system is so interconnected that allowing real failure could bring down the whole house of cards. So instead, they're trying to manage the decline, to engineer a soft landing in a sector that's fundamentally bankrupt. It's like trying to slowly deflate a balloon that's already popping. The result will be years, probably decades, of zombie developers, incomplete projects, and trapped capital, just like Japan's zombie banks, except worse because China isn't rich enough to afford this kind of deadweight on the economy. Then there's the demographic catastrophe. Japan's working age population started declining in the 1990s. Unfortunate timing, but at least they were already rich. China's working age population is shrinking now before they've achieved developed country status. And unlike Japan, which had one of the world's highest life expectancies and relatively good elderly care systems, China is getting old with inadequate social safety nets and a tradition of relying on children for elderly support. Precisely when those children are fewer in number and burdened with the 996 work culture and high housing costs. The one-child policy has created a demographic structure that's simply unsustainable. Who's going to pay for all those retirees? The shrinking working age population? How does a consumption-driven economy work when the population is aging rapidly and feeling poorer because of the property crisis? Japan faced some of these challenges, but they have robots, they have automation, they have productivity to partly offset demographic decline. China is still heavily dependent on labor-intensive manufacturing and hasn't successfully climbed the value chain in most sectors. And let's talk about debt. China's total debt, government, corporate, and household combined, is well over 300% of GDP. This in a middle-income country. Japan's debt is even higher now, but again, Japan was rich when it took on this debt, and the debt is held domestically in a currency that's trusted internationally. Chinese debt is held in a controlled currency, in an economy where the true extent of non-performing loans is hidden by regulatory forbearance and accounting fiction. What happens when this debt burden becomes unsustainable? In a normal economy, you'd have defaults, restructuring, maybe inflation to erode the real value of debts. But China's options are constrained by the need to maintain control. They can't allow widespread defaults because of social stability concerns. They can't inflate away the debt too aggressively because it would destroy what little confidence remains in the yuan. They can't grow their way out because the growth model is exhausted. Here's the bottom line. Japan's lost decades happened to a rich, democratic country with strong institutions, a convertible currency, and policy flexibility. It was painful, but survivable. The average Japanese citizen today still has a high standard of living, excellent healthcare, low crime, and high social cohesion. China's coming depression will happen to a low income country with brittle authoritarian institutions, a controlled currency, and an economic model that's fundamentally broken. The social contract of the CCP has been we'll deliver growth and rising living standards, and you'll accept our political control. What happens when they can't deliver growth anymore? This isn't just an economic crisis waiting to happen. It's a political crisis, a social crisis, and potentially an international crisis as the government looks for external enemies to blame for internal failures. A China in serious economic distress, with nationalist sentiment inflamed and an authoritarian government looking to maintain legitimacy, is genuinely dangerous. The tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. China could have transitioned to a more market based economy, could have allowed real competition and innovation, could have built institutions that would support sustainable growth. But Xi Jinping chose the opposite path: more control, more state intervention, more party dominance of every aspect of economic life. The bill for those choices is coming due, and when it does, the world will see that Japan's lost decades were a wealthy nation's stagnation. China's depression will be a low income country's collapse, made infinitely worse by a dysfunctional command economy and a worthless controlled currency. It won't be twice as bad as Japan's experience or 10 times worse. It could genuinely be 100 times worse in terms of human suffering and global consequences. The question isn't whether this is coming. The question is whether anyone in Beijing has the courage to admit it and change course before it's too late. And based on everything we've seen now, the answer appears to be no.